to take a breath. Just reach all the way to your toes and feel the floor beneath you, and bring that breath up so that it radiates and flows throughout your body. As you do so, you may visualize the life force as a light stream moving through you, changing your awareness to be that of the face of God. You are the face of God. And now I invite you to visualize someone that you may be having a little difficulty with. Bring their face before you in your mind. Touch them with this light of love that you're holding in your heart. Seeing their hearts light up. The truth of them is this light. The truth of them is this power that moves through all of us. Indeed, we are the face of God. We have this power to change people that we see of as enemies, people that we see of as different somehow. We have the power to instead ask to see the truth of who they are. To feel this radiating light that shines forth from us, embracing them until we can indeed say and affirm, you are the face of God. You are a part of me. I hold you in my heart. You are the face of God. You are the face of God. I hold you in my heart. You are a part of me. And together we are the face of God. Breathe into that power, using your imagination to see that the whole world reflects this light. We can indeed choose to see the world as one, to see every single person on this planet blessed and surrounded and encircled and aware of their divinity, until it becomes impossible to see enemies, impossible to see anything but love. Because indeed we are the face of God. So we breathe again together, feeling this light and this love. You may open your eyes and just see the blessedness of all the people in this room. The blessedness that we are able to embody right here, right now. We indeed are the face of God, and so it is. Amen. Amen. So I know a few people came in a little bit late. Did we run out of packets of sprinkles? If you did not get a packet of sprinkles, raise your hand and Dave will see you get one. Oh, sprinkles. Okay. This is just imagination. Again, couple of people up front, yeah. We're using the power of our imagination. These are emergency sprinkles. Oh, Dave, Kathy, and Mike up front need a couple too. Two apiece. No, sorry. And Mark. Oh, okay. We're out. Sorry. So now you have an emergency packet of sprinkles. And of course, I got this idea from Facebook. They were celebrating something really, really good happened. Well, I have some emergency confetti. Should I get it out? Emergency confetti. What is that? And he said, well, whenever something good happens and you want to celebrate, you can throw the confetti. So I decided we would just have an emergency bag of sprinkles. So whenever you want to have a party, you can enjoy sprinkles. How's that sound? Outside, not on the lawn, or not on the grass. Well, it'll melt in the grass because it's sugar. Anyway, so now, yeah, you're welcome to take them home with you and just hold them in reserve so you can always change your mind wherever you are and have a party with an emergency bag of sprinkles. So the power of imagination is something that is talked about in a lot of faith traditions. I know Charles Fillmore really thought that imagination was one of the most important powers. For those people who don't know, our founder at Unity is Charles Fillmore, was one of our founders. He and his wife began Unity, and they began it as more of a prayer ministry. They did not ever expect it to be a church. And when they finally got realized that people were really wanting him to do a Sunday talk because he was really a dynamic speaker and kept everybody on their toes, they started off offering Sunday talks at like 2 or 3 in the afternoon so that people could go to their own religious services in the morning and then come to Unity instead. I was inspired to dig out the story of Unity, which is a required book by James Dillett Freeman if you're going to be a licensed Unity teacher or a minister or a spiritual advisor. They've got several paths now for ordination or licensing at Unity. So the story of Unity is quite a history of the Unity movement. And Charles developed the 12 powers over years and years and years. And our church has decided to use those 12 powers, 1 power a month, as a basis for our talks. And for some reason, Charles, when he wrote his book, or when they edited his book and put it together, they decided that the first power was faith, because faith is the bedrock foundation of all the other powers or abilities. But Charles actually said, our ability to imagine is paramount. The highest and best work of the imagination is the marvelous transformation that it works in character. Imagine that you are one with the principle of God, and you will become truly good. To imagine oneself perfect fixes the idea of perfection in the invisible mind substance, and the mind forces at once begin the work of bringing forth perfection. So indeed, we can, by focusing the power of our imagination on the possibility that we can become good or possibly even perfect children of God, rather than our usual mindset that tells us we're failures and flops and not good enough and on, the negative mind stuff that we tell ourselves over and over again. I've got a little story about a misconception, a misperception. There's this young man who's working in a big corporation, and he's fairly new to the job. And he's standing in front of the shredder in the office. And all of a sudden, the CEO of the company comes running up to him and says, "Do you know how to work this machine?" And he says, my assistant is gone, and I really need to take care of this paper I've got that's a vital, important, secret part of the business. So can you work this machine for me? And the boy thinks, "Oh boy, yeah, this is my chance to impress the boss." He says, "Well, of course I can work this for you." And he pushes the start button, and he takes the copy of the machine and feeds it into the shredder. And the CEO says, "Oh, well, I only need one copy." Whoops, yeah. And I think that's how some of us sometimes go through life. We make a judgment and decide somebody's against us or somebody's our enemy, or perhaps the copy machine is a shredder or vice versa. And we mess up royally. And I like to think that maybe this young man was forgiven for that. Of course, now that we have computers, there's probably a saved copy someplace, right? So anyway, the Fillmores, when they began their story, the story of unity, they were living pretty hand to mouth. And they truly believed in the power of prayer. First, they did the power of prayer mainly for healing. I think most of you may know that Myrtle Fillmore healed herself of tuberculosis by affirming that she was a child of God and she did not inherit illness. Because at that time, the late 1880s, 1890s, the belief was that tuberculosis was an inherited illness and that there was no cure and it was hopeless and that you would die very young. So Myrtle started affirming over and over again, "I am a child of God. I do not inherit illness." And she spent part of every day praying and affirming and visualizing herself in perfect health, perfect wholeness, that white light filled every cell of her body, and that there was no disease. And after a year or two, believe it or not, she was healed. Now, Charles was the practical, scientific kind of guy, and he didn't really want to believe that you could heal yourself through the power of your mind and through prayer. But having watched his wife do just that, Charles decided, maybe there might just be something to this idea that we can change our minds. And he started working on his leg. He had a leg that was 6 inches shorter than the other one, and he ended up being a rather short person overall. He'd had a bad accident when he was a boy, fell through ice, broke a hip. It never healed properly, and his leg consequently was shriveled and 6 inches shorter. And he just started affirming that the truth of him was that he was a perfect child of God, that he was whole and healed. And by the end of his life, his leg indeed had grown enough that he was able to walk without the lift in his shoe that he'd used for years and years. And he was, he wasn't ever totally 100% what we would call perfect to our earthly eyes, but he was a light to so many people and an inspiration, great speaker, great thinker, incredible being. And his wife was his prayer partner. She's really the one who started Silent Unity. And lots of miracles happened through their work. In fact, one of the stories that I really liked, in the middle of a speech, this was back in the old days, the fire in the stove went out. And they were in this big hall, and there was no heat, of course, because this was well before central heating. When the speaker noticed the fire went out, he didn't stop his speech. He went right on. But he came down from the platform and picked up a stick of wood and took out a knife and began whittling kindling. And with that kindling, he reignited the fire. As he worked, he kept on speaking calmly, occasionally emphasizing his remarks by gesturing with the stick of wood. When he had the fire going once more, he remounted the platform and kept on speaking all the while. But the boy who was observing this was just so impressed. He felt like Charles had really ignited his soul. And he, many years later, wrote to Unity to tell about the incident. The fire that Charles Fillmore had lit, the ashes had long since gone out, but the fire in the boy's heart never did diminish. Wasn't too much longer that Charles and Myrtle decided that they could also use this power of visualization and affirmations and prayer to help people heal their finances. Now, Charles and Myrtle were pretty poor at that point in time. Charles was trying to build a real estate business, and Myrtle, of course, was the homemaker with the 3 boys to look after. But they never felt like they should offer any of their prayers or any of their services for money. They always said, it's a love offering. If you feel like you have enough to share, we will gladly accept what you have to share. If you don't, that's just perfect. Know that we are praying for you and sending you forth, recognizing your abundance on all levels. One time, they kept growing. The movement kept growing. They finally bought a building in downtown Kansas, what was then downtown Kansas City. It's now kind of on the edge of the slums, and they're trying to restore it. But they bought the building. They kept expanding, buying more property around the building. They opened a vegetarian restaurant next door. They started their printing presses in another part of the building, and they dedicated the top floor to be Silent Unity, where they would receive all the prayer requests by mail. And every single prayer request was answered with a letter, first written just by Myrtle, but then as time went on more and more, she had to hire some people or ask people to help her. And they answered hundreds and hundreds of prayer requests, and they kept growing. There's a story that they really needed to expand, and the area in Kansas City where they were was in the midst of a bunch of industrial buildings, and there was a lot of noise and a lot of air pollution, a lot of smoke, because of course, everybody heated with coal at that point. It was not very conducive to silent meditation or good health because of all the fumes they were all breathing. So Royal, the youngest son, had decided that he loved working with children. And he took the children that were attending Unity and liked to take them out into the countryside on picnics and campouts. And he kept kind of pushing his father and mother that really, wouldn't it be wonderful if we had a place in the country that we could always go to? And he, kept pushing, let's see about this. I think this would be wonderful. Now, my understanding at the time was that they didn't have any money to purchase anymore, and that one of the board members kind of laughingly said, "Well, okay, here's the building fund. I'll start it," and he put a penny out. Now, I thought it was for what became Unity Village, but it was actually for another building. And so Charles Fillmore took the penny and blessed it and said, "This is the beginning. We have the start to visualize something incredible." And so they took that penny, they blessed it, they kept visualizing and visualizing that Unity was going to grow. At the end of the first year, they had something like $500. And a couple of years later, the fund had grown to $1,500. And they felt really strongly that, yeah, this was 1920. Maybe it's time for us to actually see if we can't purchase a piece of property out in the country. They found the place they thought was perfect. It was 40 acres that was for sale a few miles southeast of Kansas City, in Kansas City, Missouri, or past it. They drove out to the place, and when they got there, they found out it had been sold. The real estate agent was still there, and he said, ask them what they had in mind. And they told him that they wanted a small place that was far from the city noises and confusion, and not so far out that you couldn't travel back and forth. The real estate agent said, I know just the place you want. He took them out to the location that is now Unity Village and showed them 58 acres that were for sale. They liked it. They put a down payment on it. And so on March 1st, 1920, Unity Village was born. Now, through the years, they kept buying up more property as it became available around them. And they started building on the property. They built the arches, which was the farmhouse that Charles and Myrtle lived in. They would go out there on a Thursday evening and stay until Sunday after the service was over. They built a big activity center finally. They built a chapel for the Silent Unity people. They built all kinds of things. And through it all, they built with the design of one of the sons who had traveled in Europe. They never really had an architect, but he'd studied European style architecture. And he built the most beautiful buildings with tiled roofs and Mediterranean style architecture. And they put fountains. They have this incredible bank of fountains, long line of fountains with buildings on either side. It's just a gorgeous setting. I wish I could take all of you there. You can see a tour of it if you go to unity.org or Unity Village, even if you Google that, they'll give you a tour. They also built the tower, which is what has been used as a symbol for Unity for many, many, many years. The tower just stands up. It still sticks out around the surrounding area, which is now pretty much overgrown in suburbs. But there's still 114 acres or so that is Unity Village property, including a golf course. and including 2 lakes, et cetera, et cetera. The lakes are an interesting story because when they started building, they realized that one of the biggest lacks they had was water. There wasn't any water that they knew of. And so they kept trying to drill wells to get a source of water for all the people that they planned to have there, staying in the cabins and enjoying the amenities. And every time they drilled a well, guess what? They struck oil or gas. Now, finally, they decided it was obvious they were not going to be able to drill for groundwater. Can you imagine being upset when you strike gas or oil on your property? But they finally decided that they needed to create their own water system. And so that was what the purpose of the tower was originally. It holds thousands of gallons of water. They built some earthenware dams and now have 2 lakes on the property with trails that you can go around, walk around the lake. And the water still comes from that. They don't have municipal water, but they, of course, comply with all the water safety standards. I just thought it was so funny. They did have enough oil and gas to fill all the needs of all the vehicles on the property. The other thing they did was they built tornado tunnels. So the main buildings are all connected underground by a system of tunnels, and you can traverse from the Silent Unity building to the administration building to, back and forth. And it's just great if the weather isn't very nice, which I've been there when it's just poured rain, and get to go down in the tunnels to get from the classrooms to the cafeteria for lunch. So some of you may know that Royal, the son that loved the children so much, was also a little bit of a challenge for the Fillmores because he was an alcoholic. And so he, struggled. He was young, a young man, had diabetes, very overweight, but he struggled and died fairly young. But that was part of the reason why Unity and AA became linked, was just because at the beginning, Charles looked at the AA teachings and talked with the founder of AA as a way of trying to help his son Royal, but also because he felt the spirituality underneath the 2 traditions so perfectly matched. So I think it's wonderful how the unity principles and unity understandings flow through so many faith traditions. So I want to tell you this other little story about the Buddha. On the night on which he was to attain enlightenment, the Buddha sat under a tree. While he was sitting there, he was attacked by the forces of Mara. The story goes that they shot arrows and swords at him while he was sitting there. But as they flew through the air, those weapons turned to flowers. What does this story mean? My understanding of it is that which we regard as obstacles are not really our enemies, but rather our friends. Whether we experience what happens to us as an obstacle or an enemy, or as a teacher and friend, depends entirely on our perception of reality. It depends on our relationship with ourselves. And that's the story Pema Chodron tells. So just think of that. Those slings and arrows that seem to be coming to you can indeed be turned to flowers when we change our perception, change our mind about people, change just our thoughts, our way of thinking, and to see them as blessings rather than challenges. Our book group has started this book, How to Know a Person by David Brooks. And this last chapter we read, I was particularly struck by, because it's a story, it's a chapter about illuminators. And he said that there are certain people that you know that when you walk into a room or they walk into a room, they just light up the whole room. They just make you feel so good and so happy and so comfortable to be in that room. They just acknowledge you and just beam at you. And he tells the story of a man who was just exactly like that. David Brooks, I don't know how many of you are familiar with him. He appears on PBS on Friday evenings as a political commentator. And he seems to me, here's perception again, to be kind of a quiet, reserved type of man who also used to be pretty skeptical and not open to the possibility that there was goodness in every person. And somehow or other, he's done this complete reversal of thinking. And this book, he's writing about, he'd gone to interview a woman who was supposed to be a real mover and shaker in her community. And he was interviewing her. Mrs. Dorsey is her name, LaRue Dorsey. She presented herself to me as a stern drill sergeant type, a woman she wanted me to know who was tough, who had standards, who laid down the law. I loved my students enough to discipline them, she told me. I was a bit intimidated by her. In the middle of our interview and our meal, a mutual friend named Jimmy Dortel entered the diner. Jimmy is a teddy bearish white man in his 60s who built a church for homeless people under a highway overpass. He leads a homeless shelter by his home, and he serves the poor. He and Mrs. Dorsey had worked together on various community projects over the years. He saw her across the room and came up to our table, smiling as broadly as it's possible for humans to smile. Then he grabbed her by the shoulder and shook her harder than you should ever shake someone who's 93. He leaned in inches from her face and cried out in a voice that filled the whole place, Mrs. Dorsey, you're the best. You're the best. I love you. I love you. I've never seen a person's whole aspect transform so suddenly. The old, stern, disciplinarian face she'd put on under my gaze disappeared, and a joyous, delighted 9-year-old girl appeared. By projecting a different quality of attention, Jimmy called forth a different version of her. Jimmy is an illuminator. So I think that's what we all aspire to be, as illuminators. And it's really not that hard. I've got a friend who every once in a while, almost every time I meet him, grabs me and says, if nobody's told you today that I love you, remember I love you. And it's amazing what a difference that can make. Just those few little words. So to conclude, I'm going to tell another story, one last story, about a man who changed his mind and decided to change his attitude. This is Nelson Mandela's story. I was in prison for 27 years. The only 3 activities I had were solitary confinement, hard labor, or investigation in the form of torture. I had 3 jailers. 2 of them are still alive and are with me today. They really are the only people I saw for most of those 27 years. And for the first 17 years, I hated them. Every brief encounter we had was filled with hatred. In the 17th year of my imprisonment, I realized that such hate was unhealthy for me and for the movement for freedom that I wanted to establish. I realized that even if I spent the rest of my life in prison, I would die from hatred if I didn't find a way through it. Most importantly, I realized that to free my people, I needed to free not only the oppressed, but the oppressor. The oppressor is in a different kind of pain, a different kind of trauma, but just as horrendous as the oppressed. I needed to unlock the hatred by finding a place in my heart for my jailers. So I spent the next year learning to love these men. By the end of the year, I knew about their families, their wives, their parents. I found a place in my heart for them, and I loved them. And that's when I began to run the movement for freedom, even while in prison. And so I invite you to go forth from this talk today with your emergency sprinkles in hand, knowing that no matter where you go, you can sprinkle a little love, a little joy, a little kindness, a little illumination, and know indeed that you are an illuminator as you do so. So thank you for listening. So we'll do our prayer for protection as an affirmative prayer. Since we're affirming that we are light, so together, the light of God surrounds us. We are the light. The love of God enfolds us. We are the love of God. The power of God protects us. We are the power of God. And the presence of God watches over us. We are the presence of God. Wherever we are, God is, and all is well. Amen. We are one. Thank you.